Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm delighted to have as my guest Dr. Daniel Chong. Dr. Chong is a naturopathic physician with a special interest in cardiology, and he did some very extensive training in cardiometabolic medicine and also in clinical lipidology and advanced risk assessment for heart disease. And runs a program called Vital Human, which we're going to talk a little bit about as we go through this. So welcome, Dr. Chong. It's a pleasure. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Hi, Dr. Sabatino. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, when I was going through your bio just a little bit, I noticed that, and this is a little bit interesting because most people have families that are not doing this, but it sounded like your upbringing led you into an interest in natural care and natural, healthcare. So talk a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I grew up I was lucky enough to grow up in Hawaii, which right off the bat is a for anybody that's been there, is a health promoting, environment. Just
no question.
Almost like you can't not move your body, you can't not get sunshine, you can't not eat, yummy fruit, stuff like that. Right. So that was part of it. I think just almost like subconsciously instilled in me. And then my father was a surgeon, and so I was always kind of interested in healthcare and kind of the general idea of being a doctor. But I also used to always tell him that he would have made a great naturopathic doctor, because he was also very interested in health and what he thought at that time was proper eating and exercise and all of that type of thing, and really instilled that into me as well. And so jumping forward a few years, when I got to college, I was in pre-med and not feeling very inspired. It was almost like there was something kind of gnawing at me, like the standard conventional medical approach just didn't jibe with me, but I didn't have any knowledge about anything outside of that realm, because again, I grew up in a very conventional medical oriented household, even though there was this side health related stuff that was also there. And so I basically kind of turned off to the idea once I got to college and started exploring other ideas, but I had never heard of what naturopathic medicine was. I knew almost nothing about anything in the quote unquote alternative medical realm. But once I sort of made the decision that I didn't want to go to conventional medical school, I started exploring that. And this was way back in the old days, when the internet was just almost literally just sort of getting started. Like I remember just having access to email my first year, but so I didn't have any internet to research, and I ended up literally just walking in a hallway in one of my college buildings that I was in, and I looked up on the wall, and there was a poster from what was then called the National College of Naturopathic Medicine in Portland, Oregon, and it was a poster with a little sort of tear away flyers to fill out your, like, send away for a pamphlet from us. That's how it worked to get information back then. And there was some very general words about it that sounded quite intriguing to me. So I was like, okay, I'm going to send away for that. And as soon as I got the pamphlet, literally, as soon as I read it and realized that you could be a doctor that used health promoting activities to treat people, I was like, this is exactly what I didn't even know this was around, but
An option. Yeah, you didn't know it was an option, so that's great. So so let me ask you a question. This big surgeon father, did it feel it was he like my son went wayward? What's this naturopathic thing? Did he go
well,
into that?
I give him a lot of credit. He number one, he was very aware of how stubborn his son is or was, still is, and probably knew it was not going to be very fruitful to argue with me too much. But he was definitely not the type to say, no, you need to go this route or whatever. His only advice was he was a little nervous about reputation, and whether or not naturopathic doctors would have the same ability to sort of or how they would look in the public eye and that type of thing. So he thought it might be a better idea to go to standard medical school first and then go learning about health after that, which is kind of a strange concept when you think about it, right? Go to medical school and then learn about health after that.
Right.
But he knew enough about how conventional medicine worked that he knew I was going to have to learn outside of it regardless.
Right.
But being who I am, I was like, no, this is perfect. I'm doing this. And
I'm smiling because your life kind of mirrors mine to some degree, because I went through pre-med and then decided to go in the direction of chiropractic medicine. So, making that journey, coming from where I did, it's kind of like the same issue. People would be concerned about reputation, about this and that. But I knew that I could be licensed in all 50 states and I could do the kind of lifestyle medicine that I really wanted to do with nutrition and all of that. So our paths kind of mirror each other that way just a little bit. So as you went into that training, let's talk a little bit about how that interest in cardiology came up for you, because obviously that's a big direction. That's a big life choice that you made within your profession. So talk about the evolution of that and how that, how you were goaded into that path.
Yeah. So I practiced much more general, what you might call general adult medicine, everything, hormones, digestive disorders, kind of everything that would come in the door, more of like a primary care adult practice for the first 12 years or so. And during that time, I was always very interested in like lab testing and that type of thing. It just sort of, I was always drawn to that. And so I already kind of had some understanding of like evaluating cardiovascular disease risk using those tools. And then I started to kind of recognize that, simultaneously in the conventional medical system and also in the naturopathic world and sort of alternative medicine world, I felt it was very, cardiovascular focus was very underrepresented amongst like practitioners. Like there was a lot of interest in, all these other things, Lyme disease, autoimmune disease, etc. And yet at the same time, cardiovascular disease was doing most of the killing out there and still is. And because I sort of was drawn to it anyways, I just sort of made a decision that I wanted to do some additional training in it to start that out and see kind of how it felt and with the potential goal of trying to fill what I considered to be sort of a relatively empty niche. And once I really started diving into it, I just got really quite attracted to it and interested in it. And that's
while you were getting ready to take that dive, had you already been involved in the research and literature of people like Ornish and Esselstyn that already was showing the reversal studies? You didn't see that yet. You hadn't seen that yet.
Zero.
Okay.
I was literally on the opposite end of the spectrum, and I think about often the fact that I used to give lectures to the general lay public about for example, about the benefits of the Weston Price type of diet, about the benefits of the paleo diet.
Right.
I was totally convinced was the optimal way to to do things and to eat. And that was for the majority of that first 10 years is kind of how
what was it? What were the years of that decade, Daniel? What
that
years
was
were
like, that was basically like 2000 to 2012 or so, 10 to 12.
Well, that literature was already there, but you had not been exposed to it. You just didn't know about
Correct.
it. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. And literally, when I first got interested in the paleo diet, I believe there was 2 books on the market that used that term. And now we've gone, I don't know. Now we have paleo pancakes on the aisles in the shopping.
Oh my God, it's everywhere.
Grocery store, right? So,
and paleo/keto and paleo. It's just gotten insane. I'm here with Dr. Daniel Chong. We're going to take just a very short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Dr. Frank Sabatino here, encouraging you to check out the NHA membership. For just $35 a year in the US and $55 internationally, you'll have access to a wealth of resources, including our quarterly full-color print magazine, Health Science. Stay updated on the latest health tools, inspiring stories, and exclusive events like the NHA Conference and plant-exclusive cruises. Join us at healthscience.org/membership and make a difference in your life and the world. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host, and now back to the NHA Health Science Podcast, where more exciting insights await you. To the Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I'm here with Dr. Daniel Chong, a naturopathic physician, and we're actually talking about his interest in cardiovascular health and cardiovascular care and treatment. So at that point, when did you, because one of the friends of the NHA and one of the people we've interviewed is Dr. Joel Kahn, and I know you had some connection with Dr. Kahn and you worked with him and learned some of the work with him. So how did that all come to be that you started finding your way toward some of these people that were a little more iconic in their work, even in the medical profession? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So the initial training program that I took part in, this was, I believe, 2012 or 2013 or so, was through an organization called the A4M, the Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine.
Right.
And they had a cardiovascular disease, cardiometabolic certification program, and Dr. Kahn was one of the teachers, and that's how I initially met him. Right. And for anybody that's ever been around him much, he's a pretty warm guy, and we kind of hit it off and just kind of became friends and stayed in contact, and we still message each other, relatively often. I'm lucky enough to get to ask him some questions sometimes if I have any, because he's, as a naturopathic physician, I fully acknowledge I'm not a trained cardiologist, right, per se, and he's had interventional cardiology experience for a long time, so he has some insight into surgical techniques and things like that I don't have. So that's how I met him, and then sometimes shortly after that, I really started getting interested, just my own tendencies. I have my strongest interest is truly in like lifestyle medicine and food. As I don't really like to think of it as food as medicine. It's just food that we're supposed to eat. So I began sort of looking at it more from that angle, especially because in the functional medicine world, you may be aware there's a lot of emphasis on supplements and things like that, which I'm not against per se, but I don't consider that the foundation of.
Yeah, but you're like me. We're talking about whole food nutrition, basically, and that's what we want to focus on. Yes, we get that.
Yeah, and so then I found Dr. Esselstyn's work first, even I think before Dr. Ornish's for whatever reason. And I still remember this was still a time when I was quite devoted to the idea of a paleo diet being the end all be all. And I'm not kidding you when I say when I first read his studies, I had a complete mental block. Like there was no way that that's possible. Was right. initial view on it. And, these people are going to die. There's not enough fat. They need more butter. All of these types of perspectives that I had originally developed in my head. And, but, I'm also somebody who I guess I pride myself in being open-minded and not denying good information if I see it in front of my face.
Right.
And so I kept looking, and it doesn't sound like I need to tell you, it's hard to deny his results.
Right.
And so I had to sort of acknowledge that. And then I will say one other thing. I came across a YouTube channel called Plant Positive, which is still in operation. The person who did it has not uploaded a video, I think, since around 2014 or so. But there's an extensive, probably over 100 videos there that literally like systematically dismantle with good research all of the ideas underlying things like the paleo diet, low carb eating, and in such a thorough way that I just couldn't stop watching initially, because I was just blown away that I was so. He really showed me how kind of the low quality of evidence that I was basing my dietary thoughts and ideas around at that time, that I didn't know. I thought this was the best evidence, but in retrospect, I really started learning more about how to look at research and things like that and think through what good quality evidence was. And so once I came across that, and again, going back to Dr. Esselstyn's info, I'm somebody who is going to try stuff first myself before I start telling my patients to do it, all of whom I was still recommending, eating a paleo type of diet. So I decided to do an experiment on myself and just go cold turkey and eat an Esselstyn style diet for, I think it was about 6 weeks, and then do some labs on me and see how I was feeling, that type of thing. And I was pretty blown away. Like I kind of mentioned in this article that's on Forks Over Knives website, where I didn't have a lot of health issues going on per se, but I'm what you might call an aging athlete, and with a good deal of aches and pains here and there from past injuries and things like that. And I was still at that time playing a lot of basketball, which is pretty hard on the body. And I was getting to the point where I was having a pretty hard time recovering. Like I had a really bad ankle, for example, that I would play 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday, and it would be sore for 4 days sometimes and then it would start feeling better. And about halfway into this dietary experiment, I realized that my ankles didn't hurt at all anymore. Or like if I played really hard, the next day they felt basically fine. And I was like, how is that? Like, am I imagining like I was almost so used to it already. It was just this very strange thing. And then just in general, soreness went away a lot more quickly. And then I did some lab tests on me, and I'm blessed, I guess, genetically with pretty low cholesterol levels and things like that already. So that was pretty much consistent with what it had already been. But I used to always have this very slightly elevated inflammation marker called CRP that just dropped into to basically almost zero, which I hadn't seen before, having checked it a few times prior to that. It was always a little bit, not concerningly high, but like higher than I would expect for this guy eating this perfect diet, And so those two things were the things that I noticed personally. And then, I just started recommending it to patients and seeing the changes that brings about quite quickly, as I know you know.
Well, that's what, people typically highlight, even with athletes, the idea that, you're reducing some form of chronic inflammation. So recovery time is so significantly improved. But let's talk about that diet for a second, because one of the takes on it is that the emphasis by Esselstyn was that the fact that he was dealing with such sophisticated heart disease patients, that he felt that pretty much all fat had to be kind of eliminated, concentrated fat. But again, within the context of a whole food diet, the idea of utilizing, nuts or some avocado and so on, those kinds of foods actually have major health benefit. So how have you reconciled, the original way that you looked at that to the idea that when you're dealing with the general population, the idea of including some of those fattier plant foods creates a better diversity? It usually kind of inspires people to stay with it even a little bit more effectively. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, for better or for worse, I'm somebody who cannot help myself but just stay sort of like eyeball deep in the world of nutritional debates and what everybody's arguing about. And I'm on Twitter a lot, and I follow people from very wide ranges of nutritional backgrounds to just sort of see what people are saying, see what people are talking about. So certainly I'm familiar, in other words, with the idea that people can be relatively closely aligned and yet strongly disagree
Right.
on a particular topic within the general umbrella. And, I'm sure, I noticed that initially in the world of cardiovascular disease, looking at info from, again, Esselstyn, and then sort of also looking at info from Dr. Furman, who certainly is a proponent of nuts and avocados, right, and higher fats. Most people pretty much agree about processed oils not being likely, right, to be the best thing. But in the realm of whole foods, my general perspective is that, especially in the general population, not necessarily somebody who's just had their third heart attack, right, I only see evidence of benefit. And I also am a pretty big proponent of digging into the research and trying to find the best and most well-designed studies to really support what's out there. But my bottom line always is what happens to the people I work with. So, right, so one of the things I do a lot of, and much more so than like Dr. Esselstyn and those types of doctors tend to do, is a lot of testing, which I find incredibly valuable to see. I want to see if what I'm telling a person is having the effect that I anticipate it's having.
Right.
And I don't like to cross my fingers and hope if I don't have to. And so, and that's both via lab testing and imaging. So point being, pretty much always will start out counseling people on a general whole food plant-based diet without necessary restrictions on nuts and avocados beyond. I just recommend, not overeating them, right?
Yeah, I mean, generally, even the people that are recommending it, they're recommending like 1 to 2 ounces of nuts in a particular day. So, we're not going over the top with those calorie dense foods.
Correct.
But at least diversifying the diet and including them to some degree, because they will provide some very key nutrients at times that can be, right, very beneficial.
Right. And so in doing so, then I watch. And right, I have had certain experiences where some people's certain numbers, so to speak, remain quite stubborn until we are even more aggressive, so to speak, with, especially more so with nuts than avocados. But I wouldn't call that super common. But I'm always, again, open-minded to just being flexible and trying different things with people if they're not responding the way that I anticipate. Right. So on occasion that happens. And I honestly, I think it's more of a weight related thing than anything else. Like some, right, people sometimes have a bit of a difficult time getting over a weight hump until they kind of get nuts down pretty low. And then we see, some changes, and a lot of times they may be able to add those back at a later time. But by no means is it, to me, something like, well, you're not going to get better unless you take the 1 ounce of nuts out of your diet. That's right. Pretty unusual. And my bottom line is, again, always, one other way I was going to put it. One thing I have a hard time with in the world of nutrition is when somebody identifies a component of a food that may be negative or there's maybe some research that shows negative effects from that food component. And then, right, they extrapolate that out to say, therefore, you should not eat the foods that contain that component.
Yeah,
even though,
it's a huge mistake. It's a huge
right,
scientific mistake, terrible
right,
mistake.
right. And I see it all the time, even though when you look at outcomes research on people that are eating the food, you only see positive effects. You have to sort of reconcile that and be honest with yourself and say, well, clearly at the very least, even if there's like a negative component of the food, perhaps there's so many other positive things about that food that the overall effect is going to be okay. And I think Dr. Campbell talks very similarly to
Yes, no
that.
question.
And so so that's always my bottom line is what's happening to the person on with whatever they're doing, with whatever they're eating, and then we work from there versus like, no, I read about this chemical component that's high in this food, therefore you can't eat it. That
Or the other side of that, you have to eat tons of it because it has this extra
yes,
nutrient, right?
yeah, yeah,
You kind of describe yourself not as a naturopathic physician, but as someone who's a plant exclusive doc that is involved with lipidology too. So talk a little bit about what that means to people, because the people out in the audience may not understand what that actually really means. So talk about clinical lipidology and what it means to you.
yeah. Talk about a controversial topic. um,
Right.
um, you know, I also make an effort to know and learn and know as much as I can on what you might say call like both sides of the fence, right? Like the lifestyle, food related side of the equation, and then what's happening on the conventional side of the equation, and not just fully uh, letting go of that without acknowledging some of the good that we've learned in that world. And the world of lipidology, which is essentially um, technically it's basically a conventional doctor that uses drugs to treat cardiovascular disease risk based on what's changes in cholesterol levels, LDL, HDL, etc. So um, so I I check those types of markers on every single patient. But one thing that I've noticed also out there in the internet world is this: there's a very polarized tribal ways of thinking where you're either in this camp or you're in that camp. And if
Right.
and so like you're in the cholesterol causes cardiovascular disease camp, or you're in the no it doesn't and we don't have to care about it camp. To me, in reality, it's way more nuanced than that. And
Right.
it's a factor. It's a clear. I tell people all the time, if somebody tells me that LDL does not contribute to cardiovascular disease, it would be like saying wood has nothing to do with a fire. It doesn't make logical sense when you look at the actual mechanisms that
I
are
agree.
going on and what's happening. But you could also argue that a bunch of wood in the pile is not necessarily going to light itself on fire.
Right.
So there's potentially more to it than that as well. So my approach in general to lipidology and the idea of bad cholesterol, good, what all of that stuff, and checking all of those things is to just get as much information as I can from that side of the equation. And I use this fire analogy a lot because I do think it works quite well. If you think about a plaque in an artery like a fire burning that you're trying to either prevent from lighting in the first place or put out if it's already there, you don't want to feed the fire more fuel, which would essentially be like a high LDL levels potentially floating around in the bloodstream and getting into the artery lining and right at that spot essentially, and feeding the potential for more fire to burn. But you also don't want to pour gasoline on the fire and blow it up. And that side of the equation is everything that lifestyle medicine is involved with: eating well, exercising,
Right.
not smoking, staying, keeping alcohol out if as much as possible, reducing your stress, so on and so forth. There's a countless number of additional things that can all serve as what I tell people: either gasoline or water on the fire. And so to me, a comprehensive approach to preventing or treating cardiovascular disease should involve addressing as many of those angles from as many places as you can to be as thorough as possible. So I don't look at it as like one factor or this
Right.
factor. the only people that look at that to me are usually selling something,
Right.
or it's the only tool that they have in their toolbox is to, statins to lower LDL or whatever it is. Like, if that's all you have in your toolbox, then you're going to use that toolbox over and over and over again and say that's all you can do. But if you open up your toolbox with lifestyle medicine, then you have a bunch of other choices.
Yeah, it's like the difference between looking at LDL alone and understanding that when it gets oxidized, it's much more devastating. So the oxidation of LDL is one of those nuances that you're talking about. And plant foods provide such a level of antioxidants that it can affect the nuance of that if you're not really careful with that. So, let me ask you a question. Within the context of that, we're talking about lipidology. You've got some supposedly very erudite people that try to really lean on the evidence base for something like keto. Let's talk about that for a second, because I think it confuses the hell out of people on a general basis, because they make the point of the benefits of ketosis that can have some benefits. We see benefits of ketosis, for example, even in fasting, when we do water-only fasting. So clarify for the audience why there's a difference between what that's generating versus, let's say, a natural process like a fasting state. And when you're eating this incredible amount of fat that could be anywhere from 65 to 90% of your diet, and a lot of it coming in saturated and transformed forms in animal products. So talk about that base and where you see the biggest shortcomings in that database that they tend to try to, lay on the public.
Well, you could start out by saying the biggest shortcoming is the lack of data supporting efficacy for that type of dietary approach. Again, in my world, cardiovascular disease, especially in the long term, because cardiovascular disease takes a while to happen in people. And I'm not aware of any long-term studies that have been done to prove definitively that ketogenic diets don't contribute to cardiovascular disease eventually. So there's a lack of that type of overall data. And then the other thing to think about, at least the way I look at it, people's bodies being able to go into ketosis are a adaptive response to a lack of food, not to just a bunch of rendered beef tallow happening to just be like in a pond somewhere when you're living out in the wild, right? So I don't think humans, in other words, are adapted to be able to go into ketosis because there's an extended period of time that humans just ate mostly fat. I mean, it doesn't take much logic to think, that couldn't have happened.
It usually was an adaptation to scarcity, not excess of fat. Right. So we know that.
So from that perspective, who are we to say that the effects are going to be exactly the same in all categories when somebody goes into nutritional ketosis using diet versus fasting? And so from that perspective, I worry a lot. I've tested patients on ketogenic diets and on very low carbohydrate diets who have lost weight, and they say they feel good and that type of thing. But certain inflammatory markers are like off the charts, or I don't know how much you know about TMAO, but I
know a lot about it. Yeah.
So TMAO level is really high. There's ancillary negative effects potentially that are still happening, regardless of what's happening with the ketones being generated or not, and the benefits of that. So I worry still, long story short, about the overall whole picture, not just like how, obviously it's very important for somebody to subjectively feel better. And I try to never deny somebody's experience. Like if they say, I went on a ketogenic diet and such symptoms went away and I feel better. I'm not going to say, well, I don't care. That's a terrible diet,
Yeah. So Daniel, one of the interesting things about, when you look at these keto people, they're actually talking about the fact that the diet is changing the markers that we're talking about in a positive direction. And so, you got to reckon with the fact that all of a sudden someone had some at least temporary drop in LDL or serum cholesterol levels. But your point is well made. What is the issue across time? What is the sustainability of that? And there's no real look at that in a very effective evidence-based way.
Right. I would also say that it is absolutely, I would acknowledge that some people get an improvement in various biomarkers, especially insulin levels, blood sugar
Right.
levels, sometimes LDL, but sometimes LDL instead goes through the roof. And there are some investigations going on right now to try to look at this class of this sort of subclass of people on ketogenic diets that have this very unusual response where LDL levels go really high and HDL levels go high and triglyceride levels drop, etc. And there are some people thinking that that may be a brand new thing that we've never seen before, where those people aren't at risk like you would normally be with levels that high. That's certainly, at the very least, they have not completed any research to prove that. And so anybody saying that, it's purely speculative at this point. And my point is also still, well, what's going on again from the TMAO side of things? What's going on in some of these other areas? And I'm sure you know about like endotoxin exposure and different things like that can come along with meat that's been through a slaughterhouse, which essentially pretty much all of it has, unless somebody's literally out there hunting and eating it right then and there. And so, bottom line, I'm not comforted yet, at least by this notion that, oh, no, people feel better on ketogenic diets and sometimes their labs improve. I want to see outcomes. Do they get less heart attacks? Do they get less death from cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc.? And I haven't seen anything like that. So especially as a doctor who has to make a decision to help somebody with what their circumstances are, I certainly can't support something that has no outcomes evidence behind it anyways. So
and the data with the plant exclusive diets is very strong on the fact that when you move into this plant exclusive way, you truly ratchet down the production of trimethylamine for sure, which is a major, and then the conversion in the liver, which turns it into TMAO, that enzyme is really down-regulated in vegans. Yeah. And that data is very solid. And people should know, as you mentioned, because they may not know, that TMAO is a great marker for mortality and morbidity from cardiovascular disease, and it's produced by the microbiota, that's involved in our gut. So so that's important information, because those kinds of nuances are typically very overlooked when people are trying to sell these other kinds of really what I'll call very fragmented, ridiculous approaches without sustainability. You know what I mean? So, and that's what we're addressing. Yeah. Daniel, talk a little bit about Vital Human. I mean, that's your baby. So talk a little bit about that and what it does, what it means, how you integrate that into how you practice.
Well, really, sort of, that's technically the name of my website, vital-human.com, and kind of the general business name I go with, and I came to that just because what I try to tell people is, I always remember. Do you know who Jon Kabat-Zinn is?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So I always remember a quote from him that they would tell their sometimes very sick people that they were working with, which is, as long as you're breathing, there's more right with you than wrong with you. And so I always try to remind people how amazing human bodies are and how resilient they are, and how literally every minute of every day, they're just looking for the best opportunity to be as healthy and function as optimally as possible. And, to me, the ultimate expression of that would be like vitality. And so a vital human is somebody who's really, essentially giving their bodies everything that they need. Now, obviously, some people are starting off talking to me in a pretty bad state. And I try to obviously be, keeping things relative to their circumstances, but I still fully, all you got to look at is Dr. Esselstyn's study to see the notion, the idea that somebody's just has less than a year to live because their cardiovascular disease is too severe, and then they live 20 more years. There's some things to think about there. And so really, that's really what I mean is just, we should all be vital. And so,
and your point is well made. Healing never takes a vacation. It's ongoing. People have this idea that it's a byproduct of something they do to the body, when in fact it's an ongoing process, much like the earth spinning on its axis.
Yeah.
Or night turning into day. You know, you don't need to think about it. You just need to support it and bring in the biological requirements that are connected to health, whether that's food, rest, sleep, fresh air, all of those elements.
Exactly.
One of the things for the NHA is that they've moved into not only plant exclusive, but this idea of what we call SOS free, without added salt, oil, or sugar. And the salt story is an interesting story from the standpoint of cardiovascular change, because there are data to suggest that high sodium intake, which is a big part of what happens in processed foods in the American diet, could actually damage the glycocalyx that really is supportive of the endothelial lining. And the idea that that could interfere with the endothelium producing nitric oxide and causing more constriction and more potential damage. Where do you stand on that data related to salt consumption and the impact on potential cardiovascular damage?
I couldn't agree more. It's very unfortunate that, again, also out there in the internet world, you're seeing people saying, no, you should put a teaspoon of salt in every glass of water that you drink, because and some people say, well, my blood pressure is normal, so salt doesn't bother me. And
right.
My perspective is that's not the only thing that it can affect. It's certainly true that there are salt sensitive people who really, they get very high blood pressure from excess salt, but the people that don't, that doesn't mean that nothing's going on. And exactly what you just stated is what I'm worried about: harm to the endothelium, harm to the endocalyx, in terms of just
right,
almost like talk about setting the stage for a nice big fire to ignite. That's basically the way that I think about it. So I don't personally feel that somebody can truly recover or maintain optimal cardiovascular health if they're eating a high amount of salt in their diet.
So Daniel, in your work, where do you see yourself going with this? Are you trying to collect data? Are you trying to create and add to the database, and somehow in the clinical work that you do, are you involved in any of that?
I haven't really gotten into that world at this point. The way things are, I probably don't need to tell you as a chiropractor that research coming from a naturopath would probably be, looked past pretty quickly, regardless of how good it is. I'm more about helping people in the trenches, so to speak. And so I work one-on-one with people around the country doing advising and via telehealth. Oftentimes with people who have cardiologists already. And my job, as I see it, is to fill in the gaps that are left open by that approach, almost regardless of how severe their situation is. I know they're not being told everything. So I do try to help people from that perspective. And I'm also about to sort of launch here relatively soon, more of a group type of program where my goal is to, not bottom line, as I know is to teach and empower people to be able to live their own lives in a way that promotes and sustains their own health. And that's the opposite of what human beings are being told in the conventional medical system. They're basically not given any idea at all that they have any control over their own health. So my bottom line goal is to help people, as many people as I can, attain the knowledge necessary to know what they need to do in terms of living a healthy diet, lifestyle, and eating a healthy diet, etc. So my program is going to be designed to teach as much as I can about the primary areas of what you might consider lifestyle medicine, however you want to put it. I just call it healthy living. And then also, what people need to do to monitor themselves over time and make sure that their health is thriving, biochemically as well. So that's kind of the goal there. So the combination of those two things is sort of, how I would be happy to spend as long as I get to be around.
Okay, that's cool. So as we wind this down, I mean, you said a lot right there. Do you have any parting words you'd like to share with the people out here?
in a way, I feel like I kind of already said it, because that's really what I want people to remember more than anything, is how much control they actually have if they're armed with willingness, and knowledge, really, more than anything, and motivation. So I just want people to be aware, and it doesn't even have to do with just cardiovascular disease. It's infections, colds and flus and things like that, whatever you want to say. We are not given the message out there that, often enough at least, especially from the people that are supposed to be giving us these messages, that we have any control or impact on how healthy we are and how resistant or resilient we are in the face of illness. And so that's my primary goal, is to make sure that people are aware that they can do a lot, and especially if they have the right knowledge. And I guess the last thing I would say is, I'm also now having to make a special effort to help people sift through all of the mixed messaging out there. So many people I've talked to, they're, well, I don't know if I'm supposed to eat plant-based. I heard keto's better for my heart, or whatever it is, and so
right.
And I'm not sitting here saying I'm all knowing. I'm always open-minded to more information and that sort of thing, but I do try to help people really sift through a lot of that stuff as well.
Well, I really want to thank my guest today, Dr. Daniel Chong, for taking the time to share his information, his insight. And I urge you, if you are looking for lifestyle support and you need that kind of help, follow Dr. Chong. You can see his website scrolling across the screen, vital-human.com. There's a tremendous amount of information you can get and work with him. And I really want to thank everybody that joined us today, because without you, we can't do what we do. And I want to thank you for being part of this, healthy, active community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Thank you, Dr. Chong, so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today, and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.